The way that we hear the teaching, the way that we hear concepts, is going to be very much dependent on our capacity, our makeup, and at a certain point after something has changed, if an insight happens, if we understand something and it helps us to relate to things differently, or at least see things differently, what is likely to happen is the whole framework is going to be heard differently. It's a good opportunity, given today is Ramesh's birthday, to for those that aren't familiar, this is Ramesh Balsekar. He was born on today's date in 1917. That's the 25th of May, and that's a happening in life that I'm very grateful happened. I met Ramesh in 2005, July 2005 in Mumbai, and I went there intending to only be there for one satsang. I think I was in Mumbai for 36 to 48 hours as a stopover on the way to Europe from Australia. And I really intended to just go and pay my respects to Nisargadatta, having heard that Ramesh was the translator, or one of the translators for Nisargadatta, and giving daily satsang. So I felt compelled to go and at least have participated in one satsang. It would have been it was my first satsang. I hadn't been to satsang before that. And when I got there, a whole lot of things happened that were different to what I expected. I ended up staying 10 days, not 1.5 days, because it started raining and the airport was closed for 10 days. It wasn't just rain, it was big floods. And also, Ramesh wasn't putting forward the same teaching that Nisargadatta was teaching. Nisargadatta would talk about, you being formless awareness, essentially universal consciousness or God. So the key teaching that contains Nisargadatta's teaching that Westerners have access to and have had access to is the book I Am That. And the title is I Am That. And Ramesh says, if I were to retitle the book, he said, I am that living as this. So there's a fairly significant difference between the two teachings, because in a way Nisargadatta's pointing was to, you are not this, you are that, and you have identified with this. You think you are this, but actually you are that. And so in that teaching, the ultimate realization as put forward in the teaching of Nisargadatta is the realization that I am formless awareness in which the whole universe arises. Now that can sound very grandiose, and we can have a realization, a recognition of being formless awareness in which it feels like the whole universe arises. And yet that might not be the full picture. That might be an interpretation that we have of what a certain experience is demonstrating to us. But there is definitely an experience available in this life, which is an experience that seems to be the revelation that I am that and not this. And so Ramesh's teaching is saying, well, actually, in practice, you have to continue living as the human being, and to deny you are this and to only know yourself as that can in fact be a non-integration of a particular part of the understanding. It might be a sticking to an awakening, a recognition of an aspect that had been missed. But that might be an aspect of the human being that had been missed. And so, Ramesh's teaching says, let's come back down to earth and understand that after certain realizations that can be described a particular way by some teachings, primarily to bring those realizations about, we have to keep it practical and realize that for the rest of our life, even if we understand that the source of this is that, we have to live as this. And so that essentially is where the integrating of the understanding I am this, or I am that, but living as this means I understand that this is essentially the expression of source, the expression of that, not separate from that. But to keep insisting or to interpret that what is living life in practice is that, may miss the fact that there very much is a this that has to continue functioning in life as if they are the main character. And it is from the perspective of the human being that life is experienced. So that was a surprise to me, because the realizations that were framed as being a realization of that, meaning the source of the whole universe, and why it can be reconciled when these experiences happen. The experience that feels has a qualitative sense to it, not just a sense like an intuition, but the qualitative nature of the experience, the state, is delivering direct feedback that what I am, and the I in that case is not an I defined as the person, but there is still a sense of subjectivity, a sense of beingness, but that beingness doesn't belong to the body, it doesn't belong to an object. It seems to be interspersed amongst the whole of everything. And so that sense, I am that, well, I lost the train of thought, I'm sorry. That sense that I am that can very much be there. Yet, Ramesh was saying, let's keep it practical. And let's acknowledge that that's not how one is meant to live life. That even though there is a sense of I am that available, is it that that's how life is meant to be lived? And so why I started talking about Ramesh is because I started the satsang saying we will hear the concepts very much according to how we have been primed by life, which includes by other spiritual teachings sometimes. So we would have been exposed to other teachings before coming across to what I'm saying for some people. And I know for me, having gone through the teachings from a top-down perspective. Now, the phrase top-down really means to come to understand yourself, understand the essence, what I would call the essence of the human being, and know oneself as that in which the whole universe arises, rather than looking at the and experiencing life from the causal level, where we're labeling and relating to separate objects. So I remembered what I had forgotten to say before, and now I've forgotten what I was saying. So what I was saying before is, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, but we can come to know ourselves as that in which the whole universe arises, because from a particular state, a particular experience, it becomes very evident that the whole universe, not a theoretical universe that extends, and includes very big planets and all of that, but rather the universe as it arises in our experience, is seen to be arising inside of us, because it becomes obvious in that state, in that experience, that all of the seeming objects are actually experience or appearance within consciousness. And the sense is, I am consciousness. I am this formless awareness in which the visual objects, the sound objects, the touch objects, the taste objects, smell objects, thoughts, feelings, all arise. And they wouldn't have an existence as an experience outside of awareness. So knowing myself as awareness means we can come to know ourselves as that in which the whole universe arises. And knowing ourselves as that in which the whole universe arises is not really where life is to be lived if we are going to come back and continue to live as the human being doing whatever needs to happen next. And so Ramesh was saying, well, that actually is the movement. The movement is to come back and continue to live as the human being. But hopefully, if certain changes has happened, you can come back, live as the human being, free of suffering. So be the human, but now without suffering arising, simply because there is a recognition that the human being is an expression of source, that the human being is not the doer, the human being is not a separate independent entity orchestrating what they think and what they say and what they do. And because of that, there can be an appreciation that life is a happening, and the experience of the human being, the functioning of the human being, is all part of that happening. And so the belief in personal doership that is judging what happens, that is worried about the future, can fall away. And that means the end of suffering. So when I got to Ramesh, I kept hearing his teaching in light of what I had come to understand as a result of the top-down teachings having had an effect on me. So the top-down teachings are the ones that tend to point to what has not been seen, what is not recognized, point at life known from a different angle. And the bottom-up teachings tend to work with what we have, current experience, and as a result of working with the current experience, can move us along so that certain other things are realized. So essentially, the same realizations can happen, but the seeker is taken through a different path to get to those realizations. And so I was listening to Ramesh talk about the fact that we are the ego. We don't have an ego. It isn't the ego that dies. We are the ego. The human being is the ego, and the human being, the ego, is not the problem. Ramesh would talk about the end of personal doership, the end of the belief in personal doership. And in order to point to the notion that this doership, this belief, this attitude towards life, the attitude that we have towards life where we see ourselves as the doer, in order to point to that being false, he would describe life as a creation, predetermined, unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, created in an instant from beginning to end, all having happened simultaneously. And then he would refer to it, life is like a story or like a movie. It's in the can. It has been written, directed, acted, produced, and it's in the can. And what we get to see is what is in the can, and we get to see one slice of what's in the can, moment after moment after moment, which in practice means an experience of time and space, an experience of moving through life in a linear fashion. And so this point was a significant difference in Ramesh's teaching, and that is to say, don't expect liberation to be the end of the person, and don't expect liberation to be the end of the ego, because he said this because he found a lot of seekers coming to him saying, Ramesh, how can I kill the ego? I've heard that the ego is the problem, and I need to kill the ego. And he would say, you can't kill the ego, you are the ego. And so to try and avoid this idea that had been set in place by, let's say, other teachings, which is not to say the other teachings are wrong. This is about addressing something that has become a problem and finding a creative way of dealing with it. So he'd say, look, you are the ego. The ego isn't going to go anywhere. The human being is the ego. Roger is the ego. Ramesh is an ego. Ramana was an ego. The seeker is an ego, and the ego isn't going to go anywhere. It's not going to die, except in its destined time when the physical death of the body happens. And then physical death of the body means the ego dies. What is the problem, Ramesh would say, is not the ego, but the belief in personal doership and the belief of attachment to outcomes that are attitudes ingrained in the ego, ingrained in the person, which force the person to go through life with this layer of suffering that stems from the attitude of seeing whatever happens in life as my doing and the other's doing. So I don't know how many times he must have said this throughout the 10 days that I was there. And ironically, I had some very significant awakenings and realizations and falling away of beliefs in those first 10 days, in the first 2 days in particular. And so having seen this, Ramesh was particularly interested, seeing me there day after day, and was excited or interested to exchange with me, to talk and to ask what had happened in the first 2 days, because he could see there were some very specific events or actions that happened that he noticed, and he was very interested to engage in me. And in the last day, I wrote a poem. On the last night I was there, just before the last satsang, I wrote, not a poem, a joke. And the joke, I won't repeat it, it's not great. But the crux of the joke was a repetition of one of the characters in the joke, continuing to affirm that they are an ego, and the wise man in the joke saying, there is no ego, there is no ego. And so I recited this joke to Ramesh on the last day, which essentially was my understanding of what he was saying, which is not hearing that he's saying there is an ego. And it's not the ego that will dissolve. It's not you seeing that there is no ego that will bring about the dissolving of the ego. The ego will remain. It's the seeing that there is no doer that will bring about the ending of the belief in personal doership. And then the belief in personal doership would dissolve. And because I had been conditioned through other teachings that had had very profound effects, so it didn't seem like it was just a conditioning in the sense, like just a belief, to see that there was, or to look at the doership and attachment in relation to words like ego, I had become convinced that ego, this word ego, referred to the person, and the person would dissolve. And in fact, that's what it had felt had happened to me, is that it felt like the person was dissolving. Whereas in fact, what was dissolving is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And yet, if we don't have that specific wording, we'll say, oh, I feel like the person is dissolving. And anyway, so at the end of this, I recited the joke, which essentially was saying, there is no ego. And Ramesh heard the joke, and he was about to correct me. Like, I could see him lean forward, and then he just sat back, and it was like, oh, I guess time will just have to do its job. So essentially, what I'm getting at is we can completely misunderstand what a teaching is saying, still have a great effect, because the way we're understanding it, even if it's a misunderstanding, can still be changing our own internal makeup. And then at some point, it will click. Oh, he wasn't saying what I thought he was saying. He was saying something different. And at that point, we will then align a little better with what the teaching is actually saying, and probably find the understanding deepens. So this is the irony of spiritual seeking, or it's not really irony, but the amazing process of spiritual seeking. Even when we are misunderstanding a teaching, it may still be a misunderstanding that is correcting or dissolving aspects of our misunderstanding, the deeply ingrained misunderstanding, that need to be corrected. So the reason I brought this up is because I would like to emphasize some components of the teaching that can be misinterpreted for a while. Now, I haven't thought about which ones those are, but there are a lot of components in the teaching that can be misinterpreted because they're delivered as a concept, and I know what the concept is, and the concept is pointing at something specific, and yet the concepts, which is wording, may not adequately describe what they are pointing at for everyone because of how it's received. And that's, on the one hand, it's the fault of the concept. On the other hand, it's the fault of the listener. And really, it's no one's fault. It's just a combination of factors. So one of them's just come to mind, what can be misunderstood. The notion of non-doership, right, which is the pointer says, what causes suffering? Suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself in life, which is what makes life uncomfortable, actually makes life feel like something we need to get away from, makes life feel like something I need to fix. So what causes suffering is the deeply ingrained belief and sense. The sense comes from the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. So we can refer to the misunderstanding that leads to the attitude that causes suffering as being the belief in personal doership. And its opposite we could describe as the belief in non-doership, or the attitude of non-doership. And then specifically I would say, well, it's not actually a new belief. It's not a belief that goes from the belief, I am the doer, that is very deeply ingrained, and so we never see the thought, I am the doer. What we see is the arising of a response, of a reaction to life, of a feeling that implies that there is the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, which we are projecting onto the other and onto ourselves. So when we see this response of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, we can start to see that that must prove that there is this belief in personal doership in place. That's why it's arising. And so the description is that when that belief in personal doership falls away, it's not replaced by a belief that I am not the doer. Because the peace of mind is not because we have a situation and then we apply a belief onto the situation and wait for a reaction from the belief. But rather, we find that when the belief in doership falls away, life continues. There are still interactions and outcomes. But now that the belief in doership has fallen away, it doesn't need to be replaced by the belief in non-doership. There is just the absence of the attitude of doership. And therefore the response that we can call the psychological response of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation doesn't arise. So that's one very important nuance that can be misunderstood. It's not saying you have to replace the belief in doership with a new belief. And because we tend to live life through thinking, we tend to, if we change one belief, automatically replace it with the opposite. It's like if we follow one political party and then we decide we don't like them, we tend to have to replace them with another party. It's like the idea that you don't need to buy into any idea or party just doesn't apply, doesn't seem to make sense to the way that we process life. It's like we have learned and grown to process life through belief, and so automatically we think if I drop one belief, I have to pick up the opposite belief or an alternative belief, and that's really not the case. We're suggesting that the human being, without a belief in doership or without the belief in non-doership, will function, and then when the outcome happens, because the belief in doership is not there, the suffering won't arise. So peace of mind is the absence of suffering, which doesn't require a new belief in place. Peace of mind is not a new feeling or sensation. It isn't something added into the equation. The suffering is something added in. The suffering is the response, the attitudinal response to a circumstance, to an outcome, based on the ingrained belief. And so peace of mind is the absence of suffering and not the presence of a new feeling. Now, an associated misunderstanding that can kick in when we talk about the non-doership, that doership is the misunderstanding and the falling away of doership, which we can refer to as the attitude of non-doership, understanding it's not a new belief of non-doership. The attitude of non-doership can be interpreted by someone listening as an instruction to not do anything. Oh, I'm not the doer, is another way of saying, the belief in personal doership can be translated into the belief I am the doer. And when that falls away, we can say there's a realization I am not the doer. But once again, the absence of the belief I am the doer. And when that's heard, that the understanding is an understanding I am not the doer. And so some people will hear that as meaning you can't do anything. You can't do what you normally would do. You can't, look forward, or you can't plan on going on a holiday. You can't engage with your friends anymore. That you have to become a non-doer. That essentially, although when we think about it, it's not possible, the thought is that I have to become more and more still. Do less and less. Spend hours on end, maybe in meditation. Meditation seems like probably the closest activity to non-doership as the thinking mind can imagine. And so someone might be functioning in life and then go, oh, I'm not the doer, so I shouldn't be engaging in this. Whereas the attitude of non-doership is not about what you do, but rather the attitude you have towards what is happening. So if you find yourself going to the fridge and opening up the fridge, the attitude of non-doership is an attitude that sees that the body has got up and walked towards the fridge. The body understands that to open the fridge you have to pull the handle. And it has pulled the handle, and then what is inside is revealed, and the body is now looking at what's in the fridge. The belief in personal doership says, I decided that I want to stand up, and I decided that I want to go to the fridge, and I decided to open the fridge door, and I decided which thing to pick out of the fridge. Now, all of those things happened. Standing up happened, walking towards the fridge happened, opening the fridge door happened, picking an item out of the fridge happened. The attitude of non-doership, once the belief in doership has fallen away, sees that all of that is being forced out of us. We are being moved by life. We are being lived by life. That the thoughts that arise in each moment are happening. They've always been happening. Even when you didn't realize that non-doership is how life has been living us, they were still just a happening. Even when the belief in personal doership was in place, that belief in personal doership wasn't creating the thoughts. The belief in personal doership was what was relating to the thoughts in a way that said, that was my thought, and the action that happened is my action. So the belief in personal doership doesn't create a doer. It doesn't suddenly disconnect us from life and say, for as long as you believe you are the doer, you are the doer. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that even while you believe you're the doer, which is just a belief, which is just an attitude, even when you have the attitude of doership, you are still not the doer. You are still an instrument through which life is functioning, which means an instrument that life is moving. We all are instruments through which life is moving, and life is moving the instrument. The instrument was designed by life, and the instrument has characteristics that mean, so eyes, for example, and an understanding that a car coming towards you is dangerous for you. So the body-mind instrument will be moved out of the way of the car. Not because a doer did it. It didn't take a doer to say, I am going to move out of the way of the car. Imagine if the body was standing in the road, and the doer that we imagine, this entity that chooses how to act in each moment, imagine if that entity went away, went on holiday. Then the body would just stand there, not able to move, because the doer is on holiday. It's not paying attention. And the body is seeing the car, but there's no doer because the doer has gone away on holiday, and so the body can't move. Now, the fact is that's not how the body functions. The body sees the car, understands that a car is dangerous, understands that there's a road and that we're standing on the road, and it doesn't require a doer to say, okay, I give you permission. As the doer, I give you permission to move. The body will move automatically based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes the understanding of a road and a car and the fact that we can get hit by the car. And so there is no doer required. The doer is an imagination. The existence of a doer is the doer comes into existence as a belief there is a doer. A belief that says, well, of course there's this entity that gives the body permission to move. That's who I am. I am the one that controls how the body lives. And it's a completely fictitious interpretation. The body is an intelligent instrument that life has created, and it will move out of the way of the car without a doer needing to be there, because there is no doer, so the doer essentially is an image that there is this character in the head at the steering wheel deciding how the body is going to move through life. And that just doesn't exist. You can, if you drew a picture of the human being with the little man in the head, at the control stick, and the human being is moving and talking, then the assumption is it's because of the little man in the head. So if we get the rubber and rub the man out, then the belief in personal doership will say, oh, well, now the body's not going to be able to talk and move. And we rub the image of the man out, and the body continues functioning as it always has. Because this belief in doership is just like the little kid with his toy steering wheel at the back of the car. And it's just an attitude that says, oh, I am driving the car. And the I, that is the belief I'm driving the car, is just a thought. So non-doership, the attitude of non-doership, has nothing to do with the body not getting out of the way of the car. It has nothing to do with the body not going to see some friends. It has nothing to do with the body, the person, opening the fridge. It means that has always been happening according to destiny. It will continue to happen according to destiny. And it's about our attitude towards what is happening being either the attitude of personal doership, which says me, which is a fictitious psychological identity. Me is the one making this body move. Or the end of that me psychological identity, and the realization that the body continues to function. So liberation, as described in this teaching, is liberation from the me entity that continually looks at what happened in the past, continually looks at what might happen in the future, and responds and reacts as though they, this imagined identity, could have done it differently and needs to get it right as to how it functions in the future. And that psychological identity, when it is looking back at the past and regretting and feeling guilt and looking into the future and having expectations and worry and complaining about the present moment, that psychological identity is uncomfortableness. So liberation is liberation from that identity that adds a whole layer on top of the flow of life, on top of the pleasure and pain of the circumstance, adds a whole layer of uncomfortableness on that. And so freedom from that identity means freedom from this layer of uncomfortableness, which then means life carries on. The body and the person keep interacting with others, keep doing whatever they need to do based on the circumstance they find themselves in, but with an attitude of essentially acceptance of life as it unfolds. Acceptance because there is no non-acceptance. Non-acceptance is what the psychological identity that says, oh, I shouldn't have acted like that. I could have done it differently. I better feel bad. I better blame myself and hate myself for having acted that way when, in theory, I say that was delivered a bad outcome and I should have acted differently. So that's what that attitude of personal doership does. When the personal doership falls away, we realize life is a happening according to God's will, according to the will of life, if you prefer, according to source. That life is like a story that has been written, and each page of the story is written. And so it says on page 305, the body will stand up from the couch. It will take 6 steps towards the fridge, and it will open the fridge door. It will then see some yogurt, some sandwiches, some salad, and it will pick after considering and thinking that it would like some yogurt, but that it's already had something sweet today, and that now out of the salad, I'll take the salad. And so all of that, the thinking process, exactly what feelings arise, are all outlined essentially in the book. It's already happened. So that's how we will see life, as an unfolding with the dissolving of the attitude of personal doership. It's like, oh, that is what was written, That was destiny. That was what was inevitable. Right? So we don't have to take these words and say, oh no, predetermined. That can't be it's really not trying to say it is all predetermined. That's not the main point. That's one way of trying to highlight the point. The point is that whatever happens was an inevitability because it happened. And our attitude of doership looks at what happened and says, oh, I should have done it differently. Really believing that an alternative way of functioning was possible. Whereas this attitude that sees life as an inevitability can't look back and say, I should have done it differently. What it can do is it can see the outcome and it can say, if I did it differently, then the outcome would have been different. But it won't go as far as saying, I should have done it differently, because it understands, yes, if it was done differently, the outcome would have been different. If the outcome was different, it could have been better. And if it's a really bad result, we might say, I could have done it differently and the outcome may have been better. However, it won't say I should have, because it says, yes, in theory, if I did do it differently, it would be a different outcome. But I didn't do it differently, and I can't imagine how I could have done it differently, because that would have required me to be a different person, to have been constructed differently, and for the circumstance to be different. The dissolving of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome also will see, yes, the outcome was not great, but who knows what this is going to turn into. It won't really think that. It will just, that knowing will arise in the form of the non-arising of the resistance to the present moment that would be there if that understanding was different. So if the attachment to outcome was there, the outcome as a result of a certain action may be negative, and what we would see is the attitude that is attached to the negative outcome, not understanding that that is life and life is going to change, this too will pass. And so there is the attachment. If this understanding sinks in, it is essentially the uprooting of that attitude. And so when something goes bad, we say, these things happen and life will carry on. Life will carry on means it will turn into something new. And furthermore, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. Now, I'm wording it as if it is something that we will repeat to ourselves when things turn out that way. Now, that might happen as the understanding is going deeper. If the misunderstanding arises, we might need to remind ourselves with the concepts turned into a thought to essentially interfere and cut off the misunderstanding. But when the misunderstanding has dissolved, meaning the deeply ingrained beliefs have been dissolved, the circumstance happens, and the understanding doesn't arise in the form of us saying, oh, I couldn't have done it differently, this too will pass. The understanding arises simply as the absence of the opposite understanding. So you carry on. Do what's next. Another concept in the teaching that can be misunderstood, misinterpreted, is the sense of doership, the sense of personal doership. And that can be interpreted as when that sense of personal doership has been dissolved, then there won't be a certain feeling in life. There won't be a certain sense. Now, obviously, if the sense of personal doership dissolves, it's true, there won't be a certain sense. But what exactly is that sense that dissolves? Because I often get feedback that says, but I still feel like I'm the doer. So I say, okay, what do you mean specifically by the feeling of you're the doer? Because let's not mix up the sense of personal doership with the feeling of free will. Oh, now I've opened up a can of worms. The feeling of free will in the moment is very different. Well, it can be, when I say it's very different, there's a very particular nuance to understand the difference between the sense of personal doership and the feeling of free will in the moment. And if we don't understand the difference, the sense of personal doership could have fallen away. The feeling of free will may remain, and let me say, the feeling of free will does remain, thankfully. It isn't something that will fall away. The feeling of free will is a gift in life that essentially allows us to have a feeling that I have a choice in each moment. Now, in theory, what I'm calling choice is inevitable, which means whatever I choose, according to the theory of the teaching, is a happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so that theory says you can only choose what you are designed to choose in a particular moment. That as soon as you see a choice happening, or as soon as a choice happens, if the understanding of what the teaching is saying is there, it would say, oh, that is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, we don't know what the genes and up-to-date conditioning are because they're highly, highly complex. The genes are, a specific genetic code, and everyone has a different one, and they're unique. So there's 6 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion unique genetic codes, which means they're highly fine detailed codes. So we don't know what our genetic code is, and we don't know what the totality of our up-to-date conditioning has been, because that new conditioning is delivered every single millisecond of life. From the beginning of our conception up to death, new conditioning is being delivered, and that new conditioning adds to and changes our up-to-date conditioning. So we can't possibly know what our genes are specifically, what it looks like, and we can't possibly know what our up-to-date conditioning is. But we do know that the genes and up-to-date conditioning is the result of all of life and this genetic code that life put in place. And so whatever I do, whatever I say, if I forget something in a moment like I did earlier, or have a mental blank, that's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I find myself in. It was a happening, and it couldn't have happened differently, because my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance was exactly the way it was. So that understanding says that the choice I'm making is inevitable. And yet, in the moment, it doesn't feel like the choice is or was inevitable. It feels, if we put the theory aside and say, yes, I understand the theory, and the significance of the theory, the implication of the theory is very significant. The implication is, if that's the case, no need to feel regret about what happens, no need to blame myself as the doer for what happens. No need to look at the other as the doer and blame them, because it was inevitable. It wasn't personal. There is no person as a doer. There is only the person as the biological instrument designed by life functioning according to life. And so not seeing that we are being lived by life means we tend to take the decisions as my decisions and take them very personally. So understanding that whatever I choose in the moment was and is inevitable, a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now that's the theory. The theory describes, let's say, what's happening in the background to make something happen. Because I say it's theory doesn't make it, let's not diminish it, because it's, in a way, you can say that's correct, that's accurate, that's true. But we can put theory aside, meaning let's put the theory on the shelf and it'll still be there and it's still valid and everything is still functioning according to the theory. In practice, let's go to the feeling in the moment. Is we've always been functioning according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning we've never been the doer. And yet, come to the practice, come to the experience, putting the theory aside, and you'll see that if I ask you a question, what would you like to do after satsang? Would you like to watch a movie, or would you like to go for a walk, or would you like to go to sleep? And in the moment when you're thinking about it, there is the undeniable sense, feeling that I am free to choose whatever I like. I'm free to say, oh, I'd like to watch a movie. And that decision is, in theory, because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance you find yourself in, which means it's not your doing. It's a happening. It's inevitable. Because your genes and up-to-date conditioning were only one way and the circumstance was only one way. Circumstance included the question and that being an available option. And so a response happened that is, according to the theory, inevitable and not your doing, because you weren't in control of your genes and up-to-date conditioning and you weren't in control of the circumstance. And yet in practice, let's not overlook the fact that in practice there is, even with the very deep, even if the complete understanding that life is happening through me and that whatever happens is a result of life's will, which means a happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, even with that really deep understanding, thankfully, the feeling of free will persists, which is great, because if someone said, oh, I can't wait for the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership to fall away, and I want the feeling of free will then to fall away also. Now I'd say, oh, hang on a sec, don't be so swift. Sure, the belief in personal doership falling away is great. Thankfully, the feeling of free will doesn't fall away, and you don't want to wish that it does, because if it does, who knows what will replace the feeling of free will that persists. And we might not land on that feeling because we haven't been pointed to it, but now I'm pointing to it. I'm saying, notice that there is a feeling of free will. So when someone understands the theory really, really, really deeply, but not deeply in a good way, but maybe so deeply that they can't, or so they've become so focused on that explanation that everything else that might coexist gets overlooked. So when someone is holding on to the concept of non-doership and actually sees it and say, I completely agree. We have no free will. Everything is predetermined. Everything is inevitable. Everything is happening according to impersonal variables that I don't have control of. So how can I claim control over what happens? And so they say, I completely agree with you. And I go, great, you've got it right. But we have the feeling of free will in the moment to do exactly what we think. No, how can that be? One, maybe because the nuance of feeling of free will might not have been heard. And secondly, they say, no, I can tell you I have no belief in personal doership. I say, right, I don't doubt that. You have no belief in personal, but don't you have the feeling of free will? And they'll say, no, I have no sense of free will. But what they're insisting on is that the belief, the sense of personal doership has fallen away. Because the understanding of non-doership has become so clear. So they say, I can't relate to life as if that was my doing. And this is great. I'm saying, okay, that's your attitudinal relationship to it. So you can't relate to what happens attitudinally as if there's a doer, because you see that what happened is a result of all of these factors, everything that came before, culminating as that moment. So your attitude can't be one of personal doership. And they say, yes, so I don't have the feeling of free will. I say, you're mixing up the attitude of personal doership, which I can agree based on your assertion has fallen away, because you are understanding and being able to explain on what basis the belief or seeing that which has happened as the doership can't happen. So you're explaining that you see that life is spontaneously happening, or life is what happens in the moment as a result of these impersonal factors. So then I can agree. It seems like your belief in personal doership has been sufficiently undermined by your understanding, and you're even telling me that the way you relate to life is not as if there is a doer there. So that is the dissolving of the belief of personal doership. However, you're also insisting, when I say let's not overlook the feeling of free will, you're insisting that you have no feeling of free will, which I believe is misinterpreting what the wording in this teaching of the feeling of free will is pointing at. You're interpreting the word feeling of free will as meaning attitude of personal doership. And it's not. It's saying even when your attitude of personal doership falls away, so you see everything as a happening, do you not feel when I say, would you like to rest? Would you like to walk? Or would you like to watch a movie? That in the moment, if you leave the theory behind, that doesn't mean if you've left the theory behind, it doesn't mean you're now seeing everything as personal doership. But we're saying, put that out of your mind for a moment so you can actually feel the experience that you, even with the deeply ingrained attitude of non-doership, still have. And appreciate it as a gift, not a remaining misunderstanding. In practice, there is the feeling of free will. And that doesn't mean that there is a misunderstanding of personal doership. What it means is there's a feeling that means you don't feel like a slave being dictated to by life. So in theory, we are prisoners in life. We are the slaves of life doing exactly what is destined to happen. But in practice, we don't feel like that, thankfully. So in practice, we feel free to do whatever I want, given the circumstances, given the restraints of the circumstance, given the restraints of the human being. So you can feel free to choose any of the available options. You can't feel free to fly, because that's not an available option. You haven't been given wings. But you are free to, choose whichever channel you would like. At least that's the feeling. The theory says when you stop on a particular channel, that was a result of the circumstance you found yourself in, your genes and up-to-date conditioning in that moment, which was not your doing. It was a happening, and therefore it was inevitable that you were going to stop on that channel. Not your choice as a doer, but rather a happening. Now, let's not get this description or this concept that I've introduced about the feeling of free will to interfere with the recognition of non-doership. The most important part is to see that we're not the doers. So if that means to see you're not the doer, you have to ignore this nuance of free will, of the feeling of free will, then by all means do that, because what's most important is to see I'm not the doer. Life is spontaneous. Life is predetermined or destined, and it's unfolding in each moment, not because I decide, but because it's happening. Even the feelings in this body, the thoughts in this body, the words of this body are part of life spontaneously happening, not because I choose, but because it's happening. That's the most important thing. So in seeing that, I would excuse someone for saying, when they hear me say, oh, but you have total free will in the moment to do whatever you think or feel to do. I would excuse someone for going, no, I have no free will. Everything is predetermined. Why would I excuse someone if that's where they are? Because that's exactly what my reaction was when I was at Ramesh's, and he was talking about predetermination, everything happening according to God's will. I'm not the doer, and all of that was very palatable to me. Before having gone to Ramesh, the other teachings had described life in a way that brought about the deep realization that I am not the doer, that everything is happening. And so listening to that description from Ramesh, it was, yes, great, tick, I'm happy with that, no problem with what you're saying, great. And then he said, and yet, in each moment you have the complete free will to do exactly what you think or feel to do. And I double take, what? I said, but Ramesh, we don't have free will. Life is predetermined. There is no chooser. I have no choice. I don't make a choice. And so Ramesh would say, Roger, you do have free will in the moment, and yet everything is completely predetermined. And I was my thinking was short-circuiting. It's like, how can you say everything is predetermined, there is no doer, and in the next breath say, but you do have free will in the moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do? To me, when I first heard it, and I expect this to be the case until the thinking actually sees the nuance in it. When I first heard it, I said, that's a contradiction. You're on the one hand saying, climb up the ladder, and on the other hand, simultaneously saying, climb down the ladder. Now, how can I climb up the ladder while climbing down the ladder? It's like you're saying life is predetermined, there is no doer, and yet in each moment, you're completely free to do whatever you think or feel to do. Where it didn't make sense to me was because the thinking hadn't refined itself, or life hadn't refined the thinking, to realize the difference between the concepts in the teaching that are talking about the theory of things, and understand that even though there is a theory of how everything works that may be below the surface theory, it could be talking about the atoms, for example, that there is also the experience level or the practical level. And on the practical level, so you can look at a book, and the theory is that the book is made of energy. That's the theory. And that the book is made up of microscopic particles, atoms, and then when you go deeper into those atoms, there are subatomic particles. And as you go deeper into those, it's all nothing. And that's the theory. And because it's theory doesn't mean it's wrong or irrelevant. It's as relevant as the practice. So the theory that everything, that the book is energy and ultimately nothing, is correct. But let's not hold on to the theory so fully that it prevents us from knowing the book as a book. We can hold on to the theory that the book is made up of nothing so strongly that we can deny the bookness and say it's nothing, which means the theory has infiltrated and infected another layer of life. The theory has, which we need to understand and hold, and it needs to become part of our system, has come in and infected the experience level. And life is a paradox, because what is present on the experience level seems like it's not supported by the theories of what exist prior to the experiential level. And once we can understand that that is the nature of life, life is a paradox, that there are these different layers, and the different layers come together to form the whole. And so if we can start relating to the teaching as being teachings that talk about theory and practice, there are two layers. The teaching also talks about circumstance and attitude to circumstance. That's another set of layers. And so we have to start being able to listen to the concepts in such a way that we say, oh, that's the theoretical description, and no, that's the practical description. And that they come together and they coexist, so they're complementaries and not contradictions. And we then also have to hear in the teaching, oh, that's where it is talking about one's attitude to the circumstance and not the circumstance. Whereas if we mix it all together, we get confused. That's why someone might think that the attitude of non-doership or the understanding of non-doership means to not do anything, which is not what it's talking about. It's saying you will function on a circumstantial level, you will function on a biological level, you will open doors, you will speak, you will write books, you will perform duties. And the attitude of non-doership is your attitude towards what is happening. So if we don't find our thinking pulling the whole apart a little bit and becoming clear about the different layers, we end up getting confused. So the feeling of free will is not synonymous with the attitude of personal doership. If the attitude of personal doership falls away, we will say, okay, the past is the past. What happened in the past has happened. And furthermore, what happened in the past was a happening according to God's will. No attitude that's looking into the past, no attitude of doership looking into the past saying, I should have done it differently. So the attitude of personal doership has fallen away. When the attitude of personal doership falls away, no looking into the future saying, I hope it turns out like this. I'm going to make sure it turns out like this. None of that. Because that's all based on this belief in personal doership rather than understanding life will unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. So no looking at the past, no looking into the future. And yet, so that means the attitude of personal doership has fallen away. And yet in the present moment, I can become aware that the feeling is, in this moment, I'm free to do whatever I think or feel to do. I'm free to decide, given a certain circumstance, to go and do some gardening. Yes, I'm going to do some gardening. And if I walk outside and stand on a rusty nail as I'm walking to the shed to get some things for gardening, then the attitude is that it was always destined for me to choose gardening. It was always destined for my attention to get distracted and to stand on the nail. And it was always destined for me to have to go to hospital and find that my foot is not usable for the next 3 weeks. So the feeling in the moment is I'm free to do whatever I think or feel to do. Understanding that the outcome is not in my control. Understanding that even that decision was destined. Which therefore means in each moment I do in practical terms. Someone can say, how do you live your life? The answer is, in each moment I do and you can do whatever you think or feel to do in the moment. That's not throwing the understanding of non-doership out of the window. It's recognizing that the predestined story of life unfolds by each of us functioning in the moment exactly the way we are designed. And that functioning includes, thankfully, the feeling of free will. The feeling of free will doesn't mean that I am the doer. It means that as an instrument of life, the non-doer, and the recognition that I'm an instrument in life and the non-doer, there is the realization that the functioning of that instrument includes the feeling of free will. Beautiful. What that also means is that we can start relating to what we can call my will, which is this feeling that I can do whatever I like in the moment, the feeling of, and I do whatever I like in practice. The theory says you don't. You do what your genes and up-to-date conditioning dictate you will do. And in practice, I say, well, I have the thought that says I'd like to go for a walk. And so I'm going to go for a walk. I do go for a walk, and we can describe that as me doing whatever I felt like doing. And yet I understand in theory that that thought arose because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So none of this is contradictory. Actually, it's all complementary. We can see that the way that the predetermined story of life unfolds is through each of us functioning in each moment. And functioning in each moment means making decisions. Making decisions we can call choice in the moment. Now, choice, as we normally understand the word choice, being my choice as a doer, seems to be contradictory to the notion of predetermination, life unfolding one way, everything being a happening and not your doing. So if I said you have a choice in the moment, you have to make a decision in each moment. Someone will say, I see that life is a happening, just like you've described, that I'm not the doer, so I have no choice. And in the same way as this concept of free will can be looked at in detail, the concept of choice, the word choice, doesn't have to remain the way we've always held it. So we've always held words in the English language, verbs, as implicitly implying a doer. Right? So the word choice, because the belief in personal doership is so deeply ingrained in humanity, in the English language, in languages in general, verbs imply my doing as a doer. So the word choice, inherently in it, as it's normally used, implies a doer. So if someone sees, I'm not the doer, life is happening according to God's will, we can come and say, I don't have a choice. I don't need to worry about making decisions because a decision will happen. And when it happens, it's not my choice. Now, once again, I can excuse someone for taking that stance. But I would refine some of the wording, because if we refine the wording, we refine how we're really seeing things. So I would say, well, choice is actually the mechanism by which predetermined story unfolds. Now, choice doesn't have to mean the choice of a separate doer. It can simply mean What happens when a body-mind organism becomes aware of several options? So take a menu. That is part of the circumstance you find yourself in. You are given a menu with 10 items on it. The body-mind organism is aware of the 10 items. The working mind processes the 10 items, maybe looks at the price tag and says, oh, this is quite an expensive restaurant. I don't have the budget for these meals in this week. And so I'm just going to have a starter. So the body-mind organism is looking at the options, which is the circumstance. And at some point it says, can I have the small chicken salad? And that is a decision which was destined to happen. And we can say that is a choice, as long as we don't have to keep insisting, as long as we don't use the definition that says choice is that action of an independent entity with volition. And now that I've seen there is no independent entity with volition, I can't use the word choice. What if we change the definition of choice from being the action of an independent entity with volition to being an action that happens in a moment, which is the selecting of one of several options? Isn't that still valid use of the word choice? We're just removing out of it the ingrained belief in the word choice of a personal doer doing the choice. So I would say life unfolds by each of us making choices in the moment. But let's understand that the choice we make was a happening, not my doing. So it's not my choice as a doer, but choice happening, decision making happening. So if someone says, look, I thought you said everything is predetermined, everything is happening according to God's will, and I see that, so I can't accept that I have a choice. I'd say, well, choice is the mechanism by which life unfolds. You are always making choices if you look at it in practice. So put the theory aside, see that you have this feeling of free will. You open the fridge, you see the three choices, or you see the three options. Some processing happens in the working mind, and at some point, one option is picked. That is choice. And you understand that that choice was inevitable. You understand that choice was based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So let's start to be more specific with the words. You have choice, but it wasn't your doing. You can say choice is the way life unfolds, but we're not in control. So control and choice are not synonymous with each other. So I would agree. You're not in control. You have the feeling of free will. That is a choice that gets made, but you're not in control either in theory, because the choice is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and you're not in control of the outcome. Sometimes you get what you want, sometimes you don't get what you want, and sometimes, Ramesh would say, you get much more than what you want. So you have complete free will in the moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do, which isn't a contradiction to non-doership or to predetermination. It's looking at the practice. In practice, you go to the feeling, say, oh, there's options. That's got nothing to do with a doer. That's circumstance, options. The body-mind organism processes those options, still nothing to do with a doer, based on it's processing the options based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's processing the circumstance. And at some point, the working mind says, that seems like the best option, so that is picked. That is choice, not of a doer, but of a body-mind organism. So both in theory and in practice, we're not in control of the choice or the outcome, but in the moment, there is choice, there is the feeling of free will. As you start seeing these layers for yourself, that means the understanding is going deeper and deeper and deeper. You will understand something more clearly than you did yesterday, if the new conditioning lands in you in such a way that allows a seeing of what is being pointed at, a contemplating, I see, choice doesn't imply doership. Free will, the feeling of free will. So remember, don't just run with your definition of free will. I've spent a lot of time redefining free will. And so if someone keeps hearing free will based on how they learned what free will meant when they were 12 years old, they're going to keep arguing that we don't have any free will, because the definition of free will when you were 12 years old meant, you are the one that is a separate, independent entity that has to make the right decisions. That is your free will. We heard God gave you free will. So don't bring the definitions from the past and listen to the definitions that are being defined. And then the nuances will exist, will show themselves. Because the nuances that are being described are the nuances of life, so that it can be felt. Another, I'll keep this as the last one, is that sometimes I say animals, let me say that enlightenment is the end of suffering. Liberation is the end of suffering. Suffering is not the pleasure or pain of the flow of life in this teaching, right? Suffering in this teaching refers to something very specific. It's being described in detail. Suffering is the attitude of personal doership. The attitude of personal doership comes out of a capacity of our intellect, the human intellect, which is more developed than the intellect of many other living organisms on Earth, to do something quite unique. And that capacity is the capacity to self-reflect, to contemplate one's own existence. And Ramesh used to call that capacity of the human intellect a double-edged sword, because that heightened capacity, that heightened intellectual capacity to contemplate one's own existence, to think in terms of language and to understand past and future, can and does go in one of two ways. It's a double-edged sword, meaning be careful, it can save you or it can cut you. And when the human intellect that has the capacity to self-reflect, the capacity to understand and recognize its own existence, I am, that intellect can then turn into suffering, turn into a story of why did this happen to me? Why did I do that? Why did that person do this to me? They shouldn't have done this. Why do I exist? Why is the universe so full of pain and suffering? All of these questions come out of the human's more complex and advanced intellect. And included in that is this capacity to to contemplate one's own existence, to recognize one's own self-existence. And then these stories can develop from there. And in the same way, if that heightened intellectual capacity goes in a different direction, the stories can fall away. And what can be there is the appreciation that I am in life. So one movement of this heightened capacity is to move towards the creation of suffering. The heightened intellectual capacity of the human becomes the basis from which the flowers of suffering, the weeds of suffering, sprout. So that a more complex intellect becomes the root of the weeds of suffering. That more complex intellect and its capacity can also become the basis on which life is, there is an awe for life and an awe for one's own existence that can bring us into the present moment where the suffering falls away. So the teaching, after having explained that, says animals with a less developed intellect than human beings have none or much less capacity to contemplate their own existence, much less capacity to think in terms of time and space. Animals very much have spatial recognition. They very much know they exist in the moment because they will run away from danger. So the capacity to contemplate one's own existence is not talking about that capacity for spatial understanding or to exist, to know that they exist relative to danger. It's talking about an intellectual capacity and a feeling capacity to turn inwards and to self-reflect. And so the teaching says, because of the more simplistic intellect, animals can't suffer. Humans are the beings in life, the biological and psychological organisms in life that are designed in such a way that they can become liberated and enlightened, which is a recognition of their essence, or can be imprisoned in a mire of uncomfortableness and suffering. So the teaching says animals can't suffer. Now, please don't bring in your definition of suffering and say, of course animals can suffer. I mean, if anyone thinks that I'm saying animals can't feel immense pain, and if anyone thinks I'm not saying that it's extremely cruel to inflict pain on animals, and if anyone thinks that by me saying an animal can't suffer, I'm saying an animal doesn't have emotions, that's not what I'm saying. Because suffering as described in this teaching doesn't refer to the biological arisings as part of circumstance. And the biological reactions are defined as both physical and emotional. For humans, financial, but animals don't have to worry about financial pain. So in the form of animals, it's physical pleasure or pain and emotional pleasure or pain. Now, the emotions for animals are going to be less than of humans for various reasons, but still very much evident. We can see animals where a member of the tribe has died, and clearly there is an appreciation of some emotional link. Or we can appreciate that there is a feeling of emotions between a mother and child, for example, or even a group member. When donkeys die, I've seen a donkey die, and then all the donkeys making a lot of noise because of what has happened. So I'm not saying that there's no emotions, but emotions are part of the pleasure and pain spectrum. It's the human suffering which is an added layer of uncomfortableness on top of the pleasure or pain of life. That is what in this teaching is defined as suffering. So this teaching says humans are the only beings from what we can tell in life that have the capacity to suffer on top of the pleasure or pain of life. Now clearly we can use the word suffer when I'm suffering from a headache. That's not the suffering I'm talking about when I say humans are the only animals that can suffer. Clearly, animals experience both emotional and physical pleasure and pain. So if someone keeps insisting on applying their definition of a word to a concept that exists in the teaching, instead of changing the word that exists in the teaching, that is heard through the teaching, with the definition of the teaching, then there's bound to be confusion. There's bound to be a resistance to what's said. And eventually, maybe that resistance falls away and go, I see why what is said and why it's correct within the context of how it's defined. So hopefully today's talk has helped some people look at some things that are sort of fairly nuanced and understand that, understand the notion or the concept in better detail. And in particular, the one that I focus the most on is understanding that the belief in personal doership falling away doesn't mean the feeling that I am the one doing the decision. That feeling is going to be there. What is also going to be there at the same time as feeling that I have complete free will to choose is the sense that that choice, so the sense is contributed to by the theoretical understanding, and we get a sense that as well as having the feeling of free will, I know I'm being lived. And so the combination of the two means that my free will and God's will stop being two notions or two concepts that are in opposition with each other. And they become sort of two ends of the one stick. It's, God's will unfolds through my will in the moment, and both God's will and my will are not two. That way, we understand that in each moment, whenever I decide to do something, I understand I am being lived. I have the feeling of free will in the moment, understanding I'm being lived, and understanding that God's will happens through each of us exercising our free will. So, let's see if we've got any questions. Hello, Paul.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very well, thanks.
So I feel I follow most of what you're saying. Here's the sticky point where it gets a little complicated for me. Let's take an example of something where, let's say that I have an alcohol problem. And so the weight of most of my conditioning in terms of the flow of my personal conditioning and just the flow of circumstances is pushing me towards continuing with this pattern. But then something happens, or maybe it's been happening, and there's a contradictory movement. Perhaps this is affecting my health, it's affecting family members. And so then this feeling arises, maybe I should try and change this pattern. And so understand that I can't predict whether I'll be successful. Mm-hmm. And that's outside, in the moment, I can make a choice to do that. And understanding that a very high of people that have this problem, probably a large number, even though they make that decision, are not successful in continuing, in actually changing that pattern over time. Mm-hmm. But some do. So there is this possibility. So I have to renew that choice over time, and yet there's no guarantee that I will renew it, because there's no, the I in this moment, the constellation of mental and emotional events that's arising now, I can't guarantee that that's going to arise in a similar form or a form that's moving in that direction in the future. So, mm-hmm. And yet, it seems that in terms of making that decision, there is going to be an attempt on the part of the intellect to try and figure out, how can I sustain this? So the intellect's going to try and come up with some practical steps which may not work or which may need to be revised. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's the part where it feels a little sticky, because in a way, you're kind of standing, you sort of have to stand on, in a sense, this placeholder concept, or this temporary, this kind of like not actually completely true concept of an I, in order to say, well, I am going to try and implement a plan, or or then in the future, the thought may arise, well, I made this decision to do this because da 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 da, and I have to remember, this is my project, even at the same time that I is really kind of standing on water rather than on a rock, or standing in midair. I don't know,
Yeah.
So that's the part where it gets a little confusing for me. It's like, when you're like, when there's a movement of life to kind of go against, to kind of not go against, but to kind of change the direction that the river is going. It's like a part of the river or a current in the river is saying, okay, let's change how the river is going, and which may or may not be successful. So what can you say about that would help me to clarify that further?
Yeah. So there's three things I'll state to start with. One is I is not fictitious. I is, in a way you can say, the essence of who we are. Or I is who we are as a person even. It's when we have a definition of I, as we always have, which is I as a separate, independent entity, that it becomes a fallacy, because that I doesn't exist. That person doesn't exist. However, so that becomes part of the belief in doership. When we keep saying I, and we have a notion of I meaning the person that is in control of whatever happens, that I is a fallacy. However, the I, if we refer to I as the body-mind organism that is functioning, then we can say I opened the fridge door. And when I say I opened the fridge door, there isn't an implication in the word I, as I am holding it, that I means a separate, independent doer. So that's why a lot of people you can hear a lot of people drop personal pronouns if they're going through a particular phase of the path, where they just can't bring themselves to say, I did this, I did that. And there can be a speaking in third person, right? Like opening the fridge door happened, eating then happened, driving the car was happening. So there's this allergicness on their behalf to use personal pronoun, because personal pronoun has always meant a separate, independent doer. And at some point we see that separate, independent doer doesn't exist. So I can't keep reinforcing its existence by using the word that has always been used to define that separate, independent doer. At some point we can say, well, actually I exist, but not as a separate, independent doer. So when we say, well, I'm now changing, or the meaning of the word I has changed. So when I say I am speaking, or when I say, it means Roger, the biological organism, is eating. It doesn't mean, when I say I am eating, doesn't mean I, a separate doer, is eating. And so then there's no issue with I and me and you anymore, because the error in it, the personal doership, the seeing oneself as a separate entity in control, has fallen away. And now we're describing what is happening. So Paul can say, I made a decision to quit drinking. On the 25th of May, I made a decision. Now, as long as you're very clear on the fact that decisions happen, because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance you found yourself in. You understand that your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes the recognition that, let's say, drinking is affecting your personal relationships, it's affecting work. So that's part of the up-to-date conditioning. So you've seen the negative effects, which are new conditioning that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. And so when you say, I made a decision, what you're really saying is this body-mind organism that is not separate from life, that has been designed by life, conditioned by life, was the instrument through which a decision was made. Now, if someone says, I made a decision, and then they explain it exactly as I have, I go, wow, that's excellent. That's exactly how I would have said it. I thought you meant, I made a decision, and you may have meant, you saw yourself as a separate independent entity, making a decision without realizing that was happening through you. Then we can see what you said very eloquently, is that once a decision is made, the outcome is not in your control. You understand that the decision that was made was not even in your control, because if the events of, let's say, negative outcomes hadn't been pronounced enough in the time leading up to that, you might have made a different decision. So you see that your decision is also based because of factors not in your control. And so hopefully with this attitude, you might be able to see that you're not actually, when Paul makes a decision, Paul isn't trying to change the flow of the river. The concept, I would say, is that the predetermined story of life always existed, and the choice to try and stop drinking so much that was made on the 25th of May was part of the river flowing. It was part of destiny. And then the outcome, whether you're successful or not, is part of destiny. And that outcome will unfold through the making of many, many more decisions, maybe, where on the 26th of May, you're faced with a decision. Shall I have a drink or not? And the outcome of that decision is a happening and not in your control, and whether you stick to it or not is a happening and not in your control. So as long as the attitude is to see whatever is happening through Paul as destiny unfolding, and that attitude will say, okay, let me do my best, because the teaching says this: everything is a happening according to God's will. You're not the doer, and yet do your best in each moment. Understand that doing your best, which might not be very good for some people in some moments, it's still their best, but it might, relative to certain standards, be sort of their best, but, not very good. Understand that whatever your best is actually life unfolding exactly as it's destined to. And once you've done your best, surrender the outcome. And so with that attitude, you can find that it doesn't mean you make one decision, that's destiny, and then you say, well, now it's the outcome. So in that moment, the outcome is you surrendered. You say, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But that doesn't mean tomorrow you don't get to give yourself a pep talk. And if you give yourself a pep talk tomorrow, then that's part of destiny unfolding.
Right. So there can be there is a place for some concept of effort in a certain way.
Indeed.
Okay.
As long as, and the attitude
because
is
sometimes
attitude is to see that effort as a happening.
Right. Right, on the theoretical level, but in the moment, it feels like the organism is, look, it feels like there's an exertion of an effort, but on another level it's happening.
Yes, and so Nisargadatta would say, this journey, let's say the spiritual journey, but also life in general, requires effort. It doesn't just,
right.
You don't just get results. It requires effort, and he's saying ideally, the effort that is required at some point starts being seen with the attitude that the required effort happens exactly as destined, or doesn't happen exactly as destined. It's always
like it's not just go with the flow. You are going with the flow in reality.
Yeah, the effort is part of the flow.
Your motto is not go with the flow.
It can be go with the flow as long as that doesn't eliminate, doesn't get in the way of effort happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it did get in the way of effort happening, that's where the concept has been misunderstood, and then the concept is sort of arising as an excuse that says, "Oh well, it's all God's will, so I might as well just pick up a drink," and that would be a misunderstanding. If you did pick up a drink, and if the misunderstanding happened, it would be God's will. Really, that's what the teaching is saying. It would be God's will if that happened. But the teaching is saying that the teaching is not saying that everything is God's will means don't make any effort.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. You're very welcome. Thank you, Paul. Hello, Lucas.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I have a question about this nuance you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's about I don't understand if how it's possible when I don't have that attitude, or if I have the personal Doership attitude, and when I don't have it, if it's how it's possible that it's not seen. I mean, if it's not felt.
Yeah, so you're saying, how is it possible that we can be so mistaken about life? Is that right?
No, no. It's it's for example, if I decide to do something, for example, I want to go to the kitchen and make some tea, and I go to the kitchen. I completely forget about tea and do something else. I go back and then I realize, oh, I wanted to have some tea, and this I don't feel as my doing. It's felt like I was because the decision was not there. It just happened. But if in case I made the tea, I feel it's my doing.
Right.
It's not about decision, but about this doing. And you said it's like the same. If, as I understood it, it's same. If I have this attitude of Doership or not, it's like the same. So what's the point then?
If you have the attitude of doership, you're still not a doer, is what I'm saying. It's like whether. So, is that the part you were talking about? That when I said, if you have the attitude of doership, that doesn't make you a doer. You are still a non-doer. But you have the attitude of doership. So what I'm saying is, like, if a robot thinks it is the doer, as in thinks that it is making its decisions because it is using its volition, it's making its decisions independent of anything else, then that's a belief that the robot might have, but it's not how things are actually happening. So what it's saying is, if the robot believes it is the doer, the truth is it still actually is a robot functioning exactly according to its programming. So the belief that it's the doer doesn't make it a doer. It still makes it a machine functioning according to its makeup and its design. Does that make sense?
Understand this, but I didn't understand the difference then for the robot. If it's programmed, it has belief and don't believe, and if it's not a difference for the robot, or in this case for me,
well, there is a difference in the experience. What I'm saying is, it doesn't change the robot actually from being a robot into being a personal doer. It always is a robot functioning according to its design. But if the robot had the belief, the robot would then feel shame, would feel pride, would feel blame, which are secondary layers of suffering that stem from that belief. So for the human being, if they have the belief of personal doership, then all of this suffering arises. When the belief is dissolved, the suffering dissolves with it. So what I'm getting at is, the human being has never been the doer. The human being is always an instrument through which life is functioning, even when it believed it was the doer. When it believed it was the doer, which is a mistake, it never was the doer, it never is the doer, the belief that it's the doer makes it feel uncomfortable in life. So that's the difference in the experience. The belief in personal doership means there's suffering and uncomfortableness. When the belief in personal doership dissolves, the uncomfortableness falls away. And that's when we realize, oh, I am not the doer. I'm functioning according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And even when I thought I was the doer, I was still only functioning according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I never was the doer, I just believed I was the doer.
So the experience of some current action is the same, but the additional suffering, it is or it's not there.
Exactly.
But the feeling while doing it, it's like the same experience.
The feeling on the biological level is the same experience, yes. But attitudinally it's different. Attitudinally it's different. And so when the belief in personal doership falls away, we'll still feel this feeling of free will, but there is a sense of being lived. There is a sense that life is flowing through me, but that sense of life is flowing through me is not contrary to the feeling of free will. The sense of life is flowing through me is contrary to the belief in personal doership. And so what you're left with is the feeling of free will. I'm free to do whatever I want, with the accompanying feeling that actually what I feel like is what life feels like. So there is a change, but mainly the change is the falling away of this attitudinal layer. That means no feeling of suffering and the sense that I'm being lived, with the feeling of free will in the moment.
Okay. Okay, I have to contemplate this attitude stuff, because I just don't understand it somehow. It's because it should be there like first, before something happens.
Simultaneous to it. You can't decide, you can't bring the attitude in. You don't decide your attitude after something happens. Your attitude is a result of how you are shaped by life up to a particular moment. So if in this moment life has included the attitude of personal doership, then when something happens in 30 seconds time, the response is going to be one of the attitude of personal doership. However, if over the next 6 months life starts to wear away the attitude of personal doership, then as events happen, the attitude that arises is a diminishing attitude of personal doership. And eventually, if that attitude has completely gone, when an event happens, the attitude that arises simultaneous to it will be an attitude not of blame, not of shame, not of pride, not of expectation. So it's not up to you to control your attitude. Your attitude will be in accordance to how life has shaped you up to this point in time.
I just imagine that it's a relationship with the attitude is a relationship with circumstance.
It is.
So it has to be created later, like just after, because I don't know in advance what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. It is your attitude to circumstance, and it does happen simultaneous or just after. You're correct. But that attitude is not something you as a doer create. That attitude is, in principle, the same as, if someone gets a sharp object and presses it into your hand, there is a movement away from the sharp object, right? Because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, your biological intelligence, your biological preferences. The sharp object creates pain. It's known to be dangerous, let's say, and so the body just moves away based on its design. And you don't create the moving away, right? The belief in doership might say, oh, I moved away quickly. The fact is that moving away was a biological reaction that happened, and you didn't need to do it. It was going to happen anyway. It did happen anyway. It happened automatically. And the attitude that arises after that is also arising on the same principle. The attitude will be just an expression of what is in place at that moment. So you don't have to create the attitude. The attitude arises automatically just after the event happens.
Okay. Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome. Go back and listen, because there's a lot of nuances. I think you'll get it.
Yes, thank you. I hope so.
Okay, thanks for coming. Okay, well, it looks like we've just hit our time limit. So on this 103rd anniversary of Ramesh's birth, I wish you all peace.